Good evening and welcome to the overnight edition of From Day One. We now continue with the Art Bell interview on remote viewing as we rock through Dominion.
Met me here, in fact, on a couple of occasions, and I ended up working with Bob on long weekends for approximately 14 months in his lab, with the idea that he would teach me to control my out-of-body events, which were occurring spontaneously since my near-death experience in 1970. We also expected him to help me reduce some of the problems I was having with my cool-down prior to remote viewing, because my cool-down periods were becoming extensive as a result of so much remote viewing.
What do you mean cool-down periods?
Before I do a remote viewing, I have to clear my head from the previous remote viewing.
Right.
And that takes some doing. And as a result of being the only viewer left in the project for almost a 2-year period, that cool-down period was becoming more and more extensive because I was having to do so many remote viewings.
So what is that like? I mean, do you end up with severe headaches? Are you fatigued totally?
You can. It's very stressful because you may be jumping from a kidnap victim straight into a torture victim, straight into a stolen nuclear weapon or something. And so it's not like each remote viewing is not that important. They were all critical. And going from one to the next, they expect you to just jump from one to the next. And
I see.
That period of time in between when you try to empty your mind and prepare for the next remote viewing becomes critical to the success. And I was becoming very stressed out about that.
Okay, you said two things that I can't let pass. One, near-death experience, and the other, out-of-body experiences. Both are fascinating things for me, and so really, I can't just let them roll by. What happened near death?
In 1970, I had a near-death experience, which was actually, to cut to the chase, I was sitting in a restaurant having a before-dinner drink and went into convulsions. I got very, very ill feeling, and I didn't want to be projectile vomiting or something in a restaurant, so I excused myself, and I just made the front door and collapsed on the sidewalk. And what I didn't know is that I had gone into convulsions and swallowed my tongue. And when you swallow your tongue, you can't breathe.
Right.
So it's only a matter of time until your heart stops. And I was in Austria when this occurred. I was in Braunau, Austria, right across the Elbe River from Germany. And my friend came out with my wife, and he tried to revive me and couldn't, so they put me in a car and drove me 38 kilometers to the hospital in Passau, Germany.
Right.
And had to cross a border checkpoint to do that. And that took some time, so I was delivered DOA to the hospital or the emergency room in Germany, and had been DOA probably somewhere between 8 and 15 minutes.
Oh my God. So you should have been really dead.
I was very dead, according to the doctor anyway. I became comatose when they get a heartbeat, and they honestly didn't think I would come out of the coma.
And if you did, probably with brain damage.
Yeah, and I came out of the coma, and it was less than 24 hours later, and when I came out of the coma, I started telling the German patient in the room with me that I started speaking to him in broken German and English. I said, you can't die, God's a white light, and everything's going to be fine.
Wow.
And he freaked out, and the doctor came in and sedated me again. So,
do you really believe that, Joseph, that you cannot die? That is to say, cease to exist totally, that there is something on the other side, no question about it in your mind?
There's no question in my mind. I know it's argumentative for a lot of people. One of my best friend, he's almost a brother to me, Dr. Edwin May, is a materialist, and he thinks that that's crazy, and we talk about it sometimes. But that's what I believe, and I can't change my mind because
wouldn't want you to. I just want to ask you about it. You were gone a long time, so I am exceptionally curious about your near death. It really should be called death. You were on the side. What happened?
Well, I don't. It was a classic near-death experience. I mean, I found myself out of body, watching everything, and when I followed the car and my body to the emergency room, and when they got there, I watched them cart me in and throw me on the table and cut my clothing off and stick things in my body and whatnot. And I floated up near the ceiling, and I felt heat on the back of my neck, and I thought, oh, I must be up against that, that really bright light they have in the ceilings of emergency rooms.
Right.
And so I turned around to look at it and found myself falling through a tunnel, and the tunnel walls were made up of people. And I closed my eyes to shut them out and reviewed my whole life, basically in an instant, and popped out the end of the tunnel and was enveloped in a very intense white light.
Was it, when you were in review, was it judgmental?
Only judgmental in the sense that I judged myself. There was no one looking over my shoulder. There was no God being there. There was no one there helping. It was just me dealing with the things that
you had done, and that's pretty hard. That can be very harsh.
That's the hardest. Believe me, that's the hardest kind of judgment.
I believe you.
And at the end of that, you pop out of the end of the tunnel, and you're enveloped in this completely comforting and loving white light, which at the time I had the need to say that's what God is, only because I had no basis for ever having experienced it before.
I was going to say it's obvious you passed the test,
Well, something passed because I decided I was going to stay, and it decided I wasn't, and I was told in my mind that I had to go back, and I said no, I'm staying right here. I'm perfectly fine right here. And there was sort of a snap, like a snap of the fingers, and I sat up, and I was under this sheet in this room with this other patient, and that's when I told him that, God's a white light, you can't die, everything's going to be fine. And then they sedated me again, I think because they thought I was suffering from brain damage. I woke up the next day on a gurney with being put in the back of a limo with the windows taped up with tinfoil. And they took me to Munich and put me in a rest home, in the wing of a rest home they had leased, I guess.
Wow.
And I spent almost 2 weeks there. They didn't have the MRI machines and all that back in 1970, so I had to undergo a lot of testing to ensure that my brain cells weren't all dead.
All right, hold it right there. Boy, if nothing else, this was worth it. That was some depth experience to hear about. Just incredible. I'm Art Bell.
This is Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell. Now, here's Art.
From my perspective, the death experience that Joe just described is, at another time, Joe, I would have done a whole show on that. That is so impressive. You were dead, period, and you were dead for many minutes. So what you have to say about that, I think think is interesting, not just to me, but everybody out there.
Yeah, I imagine it would be. It was interesting to me.
I'm sure it was. And then somehow, after that, I guess you began to have out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, I started from that point on, after they, of course, kept me for a number of weeks to determine my stability. And once that was determined, they kept me in the Munich area for a while, but actually another 7 years they kept me overseas. But a lot of things changed for me. I stopped doing a lot of things that I had done before. I became a much milder, gentler person. And
was it because of the review?
It was partly that, and it was partly the fact that I came to understand that my actions had tremendous effects on not only myself, but on the people that cared about me a great deal that I might not even know I was affecting.
Got it.
And that also it had great effect on the kinds of reciprocal action that I got to enjoy as a result of my own action. In other words, I viewed myself from that point on as sort of being a farmer that plants seeds all the time that grow fruit, and the fruit I always get the harvest myself. The problem is if you're unconscious and totally unaware and you're planting seeds, you may be planting them in anger, and that produces a negative or deconstructive fruit that you get to enjoy. And
all right. Briefly,
so I wanted to change everything.
I get it. Briefly, with respect to OBEs, again, we could do a whole show on that, and I have done whole shows on it. It is, I am told, possible to leave your body. I've heard the story of the silver cord that attaches you back to your body, and then if anything goes wrong, you come snapping back to your body, and all is well. So it's very safe, they say.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. I have been out of body as a problem solver. In other words, I've had surgeries that were that ended up being extremely uncomfortable or very painful, and as a result, I've chosen to leave my body during the recovery rather than be in it. And during those periods of time, I've gone about as far out as you can possibly go in terms of stretching that, whatever that cord is, and far enough to forget who you are and what you're doing. And in every case, I've suddenly come to a stop and tried to remember what it was that I was remembering, and in doing so have been gradually pulled back faster and faster until I wound up back in my own body. So I think as long as you're breathing, that you are in fact alive. In reality, it's impossible to become separated from your body.
I hope so, Joe. The people that I've talked to about OBEs before, I've always challenged them with this, and that is, as we all know, a lot of people die in their sleep.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Natural causes. And I always wondered how many people doing OBEs could have possibly, kicked off during the OBE or because of.
I would suspect that there's probably some small percentage that's happened with, and I can understand where someone would be very confused if that were to happen. Not being able to go back to a body. But that confusion, I think, goes away very rapidly because in the processes of actually dying, you're out of body anyway. I mean, your consciousness leaves the body, and it is introduced into whatever that next phase is going to be vis-a-vis the near-death experience, or at least part of the near-death experience. introduction to the light. I don't think the light is God anymore. I've had a second near-death experience and was not allowed to go to the light, but I was allowed to see it. And the problem with that is, in seeing it, I could see it had edges. And unfortunately, my definition of what God is, God cannot have edges. It's an infinite being. So I had to reorganize my thoughts concerning the light and some of the events of my first near-death experience.
Maybe you can help me out with something that really has been driving me nuts.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine, John Lear, you know that name, I'm sure.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
In an interview he did with me, classically, told me, Art, if you die, don't go to the light. It's a trick. That is driving me nuts. Absolutely driving me nuts.
Well, I guess you could call it a trick, because we call it. Most people who have an experience, a near-death experience, eventually become enveloped by the light, and in almost all cases report that this is what God is. The problem is, it's such an overwhelming experience. We have no definition for it. We have nothing within us that has had anything close to that experience before. So we call it the ultimate thing, the one thing that we've not been able to address, which is God. And I don't think that's what it is. I think what the light is what I call the totality of identity. It's what we are as an energy being when we're no longer physical. And so it's the reason why in the light we feel so comfortable and so at home and so whole and at peace. It's because we are finally in our major construct again. Where all of our experience relies, lies. It's the same place where all knowledge that we've collected over a multitude of lifetimes comes together or coheses. And so we have this huge urge to call it God. But I think in the sense that we're created in the image of the Creator, it's probably representative of what the Supreme Being might be, but only in the sense that we can understand it. In terms of what God might be, I don't think we have the tools for it. I really don't. All these definitions we have for God in our physical world, I think, are just human manifestations of what we would like to see. And of course, we imbue those manifestations with all kinds of rules and laws and things, and we kill each other over it.
Yes.
It's what I call the designer God problem.
Okay. Would it be fair, Joe, to call what you felt during that time as heaven or heavenly? Is that?
Yeah, I like to think of it as the totality of being. It's everything that you can wrap up in what we call the human experience from a multitude of lifetimes. It's certainly a very small fragment or image of what the Supreme Being might be.
Right.
So, in a sense, it is God in that it gives us a taste or a feeling of what it could be. But what I would call the definition of God, or the understanding of what a God might be, is so beyond my ken. I wouldn't even attempt it. I don't even know what being human is all about yet, and that's what I'm trying to figure out now. What it means to truly be human and express full human compassion and capacity and all those things. I just don't think we're equipped to do that either.
Yeah, you mentioned that all of this, the near death, the OBEs, everything changed you as a human being. Absolutely
changed me irrefutably. It's as though I was run down by a Mack truck, and I find it laughable that people say, "Oh, well, it's just a chemical thing that went off in your head because you were dying."
What they say.
Yeah, I know. That's because they've not had the experience.
Okay. Any indication at all? If what you felt was near heaven, I wonder if there is another. I mean, I'm going a little biblical on you here.
Mm-hmm.
But if there is this place of joy,
Mm-hmm.
is there something else for others who didn't go through the self-examination with flying colors?
I think there probably is, but I don't think it's a permanent. It's a place of permanence. I think it's a place where we actually condemn ourselves.
Right.
We feel we need to pay, and so we force ourselves to pay. It's kind of like I'm not smart enough yet to live in the big house, so I'm going to go down here and change the exhaust systems on cars for 20 years or something, work in the pits.
Right. Okay.
That kind of thing.
All right.
It's sort of like paying your dues, only paying them late with interest or something like that. It's a self-condemnation more than anything.
Okay.
That's my sense of it anyway.
So there may be this other place, though you didn't see direct evidence of it in your experience.
No, I had a sense of it in the feeling of pain that I was getting from others in the tunnel. I had a sense that they were stuck and didn't know how to extricate themselves.
Oh.
So that in a sense might be a form of that. I don't know.
I mean, were you seeing people in agony?
I was seeing people in certainly in emotional pain, wanting help because they were grabbing at me and asking for help, and there was nothing I could do to help them. It's such an individual.
Joe, not that individual. I've interviewed people with near-death experiences who have described, trust me when I say this, just about what you're saying. Even the people along the way, all of that, it really was about the same, frankly.
Yeah, and that in itself is humbling. I mean, you can't come back from that experience and not want to have empathy for others and understanding for others, especially for those that aren't doing the right thing. It's kind of a funny way of looking at it, but you start looking at your enemies differently, looking at the people you don't like differently, and wishing that there was something you could do for them.
Well, I guess that you're blessed in a way because you've had this experience that others have not had, and they just go on with their ways until the end, and then they get a really tough review.
Or they get a really big surprise, one or the other.
Okay, well, we actually came to talk about remote viewing, but you got me way off track because those things are so fascinating. We could do entire shows on them. So let's come back to remote viewing for a moment. And so you were in the Project Stargate CIA thing, right?
Right. I was the only viewer that was in it for its entire 20 years, in fact.
20 years, long time.
Yeah.
It's a very long time for the CIA to continue a program that ultimately, I seem to recall, they suggested was not productive when they ended.
Right. They suggested that. In fact, it was said outright by Robert Gates on the Nightline program where it was outed, which incidentally was the only Nightline program that was actually done ahead of time and edited. All the rest of the Nightline programs were live, except that one. And much of the comments made in answer to some of Robert Gates' statements were edited out.
Redacted.
Yes, redacted. The fact of the matter is, he said very specifically that in no case had remote viewing information ever been used as standalone information in the intelligence arena. And in fact, that's kind of lying by omission, because in fact, no intelligence, single source intelligence, is ever used as standalone intelligence. They always have some complementary intelligence, or they don't use it. In other words, they have to have two sources, or they just don't use it, no matter how good it is.
Gotcha. All right. Hold tight. Quick break, and we'll be right back. Joe McMonagle is my guest. Probably the best remote viewer in the U.S., probably the best remote viewer in the world. This guy is the real McCoy. Now, this is really something. From the high desert, I'm Art Bell, and this is Midnight in the Desert.
Initiate a dialogue sequence with Art Bell. Please coordinate your phalanges and call 1-952-225-5278. That's 1-952. Call Art.
Well, all right. Hold your calls, everybody. Phones are going nuts. Just relax. We'll eventually get calls. My guest is Joseph McMonagle. I think the nation, the world's premier remote viewer. And there's so much to cover here that, just trust me, we'll get to the lines. Don't stress yourself out dialing and dialing and dialing. Joe, welcome back. I want to ask basic questions. For example, how far is there a distance limit to what remote viewers can see?
You mean in terms of physical distance?
That's right. Yes.
No, they've not found one. Let's put it that way. They did a series of remote viewings in the late 70s, early 80s, where they targeted some viewers at SRI and a number of other places on outer rim planets, because they knew that they would be launching the Explorer series satellites, and they actually got remote viewing back on the makeup of the atmospheres and the geology and that sort of thing. And in fact, Ingo Swann, who was probably the person who came up with the name remote viewing at SRI, he was a fantastic artist, oil painter, and he did a lot of cosmic type paintings, and he painted some of the outer rim planets years before any of the satellites got there to actually photograph them. And he put rings around Uranus and put a twist in one of the rings of Saturn, and did a number of things in his paintings that everybody questioned him on, and he said, well, I did it because that's the way it looks.
Joe, again, I was honored to interview Ingo Swann. And
that's wonderful.
At the time, I think he was considered to be the most talented natural psychic remote viewer. Was that true?
Yeah, well, he's always been a great remote viewer. There are some true greats that existed as a result of the research done at SRI. Pat Price, of course, was the first one. Ingo Swann was doing remote viewing at Maimonides in New York long before he came to SRI. And before any of them was a man named René Walcollier, who was a Frenchman, who did remote viewing for 30 years with his daughter. And he presented his work at the Sorbonne in 1946. So, there's a whole string of extraordinarily great remote viewers, psychics, that have demonstrated their ability to do this in basically double-blind scenarios that are unquestionably good.
Okay. Since you're obviously one of them, the next question I find very interesting, and that is, how far into the future, and we'll get more specific, into the past, are you able to remote view? Is there a limit?
There is going into the future, but it's self-limiting. The problem with going into the future, you don't have to go very far into the future before you start dealing with things that exist, but for which concepts don't exist yet.
Yes.
So trying to explain those or trying to draw them and say what they do is extremely difficult because the concepts aren't real yet. It'd be sort of like describing how to cut steel with a light beam in the year 1890.
Or perhaps asking somebody to remote view in 1890 what an iPhone 6 was going to look like.
Exactly. And the problem is that people would look at you like you're crazy.
Sure.
When you start describing those things. And the converse happens when you look too far into the past. When you look into the past and let's say the target is how is the Great Pyramid built? Everybody wants to know that. And you give a really good description and not only does no one believe it, but it turns out that it can be 100% correct, but if it goes against what is commonly thought to be true at the time, then you're getting in arguments and fights with people who are Egyptologists or archaeologists or whatever, who have already made their mind up on how things were done or should have been done.
Well, I'm willing to risk it, Joe. How were they built?
Well,
if you know.
When I did the target, the first thing out of my mouth was they're lowering stones into the water and there's guys walking on the surface of the water. And my monitor looked at me really strangely and he said, wait a minute, you just said there are people walking on the surface of the water.
Yes.
Did you mean that? And I said, well, it looks that way. When in fact what they've done is it's a very large lake and they've dammed the water and it's making a perfectly flat engineering plane for leveling the stones, because that's the significant problem in building a pyramid is the lower 1/3 has to be absolutely square and perfectly balanced, or the entire pyramid slides off to one side. And so what they did is they dammed the lake to do that, and everybody said, "No, you're nuts because it's the desert." And then I did that in 1983, and I had a loading dock, and I had huge reed boats and cranes and all kinds of things. And in 1996, on the front page of the LA Times, over a 2 or 3 week period, they had everything that I had said in my remote viewing in 1983 was printed on the front pages of the LA Times. They had discovered an archaic lake existed adjacent to the pyramid, and then they discovered a loading dock 100 and something kilometers away where they were mining the stone, and large reed boats and larger boats made of wood buried in the sand, and that sort of thing.
You think it's been validated?
Well, it's been validated to the extent that I think it needs to be validated. What upsets me, Art, is back in '83 when I was saying these things, somebody that was working on their doctorate in Egyptology could have taken what I said and said, well, if it's true, then the shoreline of the lake had to exist at such a level. And they could have taken any geologic map and gone out and found villages along that would have established the archaic lake. And, that would have finished their doctorate paper right off.
Indeed. All right. Hold it there. I don't know what's happening to the show. It's just going away so fast. And I've got so many questions. Joe McMonagle is my guest. Probably the world's premier remote viewer. And I've just made a tiny dent in where I want to go. Yikes. This is Midnight in the Desert.
Midnight from the high desert and the great American Southwest. This is Midnight in the Desert, exclusively on the Dark Matter Digital Network. To call the show, dial 1-952-CALL ART. That's 1-952-225-5278.
Again, please hold your calls right now. Not yet, folks. Don't waste your time calling. Joe McMonagle, I think the world's premier remote viewer is here, and I want to follow up. He's talked to us about remote viewing the pyramids, and so that brings on another question, and here it is. As you look back in time, Joe, when remote viewing, do you think that the magnitude of the event that you're trying to remote view has an effect on seeing it either more clearly or not?
No, I don't. In fact, we know from the research that what generally drives more information above the level of noise, so that it's clearly picked out and seen and described and whatnot, is the entropy level of the target. And the other thing that has a direct effect is the common intent and expectation that everyone has that might be shared in the targeting. For instance, the viewer, the monitor, the person who put the target together, a shared expectation or a shared intention is extremely important.
Are you familiar with all the research being done into consciousness? Because it sounds like it might fit in a little bit here. As an example, in the studies that they have done at a university with these things they call eggs, which are random number generators, and they found that near large events like 9/11 is the best example probably, there's this giant spike in random number generators worldwide becoming less random. And what you just talked about a little bit sounds like it could relate in some way to the amount of intent, consciousness.
It might. I'm not seeing a good definition of consciousness yet. That seems to be eluding everyone, and I think that's absolutely needed in order to pursue any kind of serious discussion about it. There are so many different variations in the understanding of what consciousness represents that until we have that, everybody's just kind of arguing from their own street corner.
I mean, maybe we've got to settle for, like porn, when you see it. Or something,
yeah,
I don't know.
That sort of thing. When you see it, you recognize it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. As they work on AI, it's going to be interesting one day when they get the best computer or whatever it is they come up with that actually is aware of itself. I think that's as close as you can come.
Now you're scaring me, Art.
Why?
AI bothers me because we as human beings are not consciously aware enough to guarantee that there is integrity and morality in our decision making.
Ooh, that's right.
And to have AI making decisions in our stead when that just scares me a little bit, because if a machine became aware and conscious and had no balanced integrity and morality involved, then I think it would eliminate us right off the bat. So
if it was smart, yeah.
It would just automatically eradicate human because we're so flawed, perhaps. I don't know. AI systems, as long as they're independent, in other words, they're bolted to the floor and independent of any other machines, I think they can be controlled. But if they're ever connected, one machine to another, and not bolted to the floor, we're in trouble.
And with that, we will leave that conversation for tonight. Come on back tomorrow night for more on the remote viewing, AI, and everything else. that, unfortunately, I'm feeling under the weather, so I am going to have to call this episode to a close. Please make sure you do like, share, and subscribe. Help get us to the goal of 50,000 views, 1,000 subscribers. So Boxy sends us nice red packages we can send to you, and Google puts us on the algorithms. Coinbase, Ibotta, Game.gg, you know the drill, fun those. And until next time, like, share, and subscribe. Be kind on one another, and release the Krakens as we march this overnight and every overnight here from day one. Have a great night's sleep. We'll all see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.